Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Young, and today we're going to talk about 5 surprising facts and prophecy related to the Antichrist. Coming right up. Okay. So we get a lot of problems when we come up with this conversation about the Antichrist. Who is this guy? Now, here's what we have to first do. You want to talk about the Antichrist, you need to go to the Bible. If you want to pull out a concept, let me just pull something out here. If I wanted to argue what would Sherlock, what would Sherlock Holmes do? I'm focusing on the writing of Sherlock Holmes. If I'm going to talk about Star Trek and what would happen in the Star Trek universe, I would never utilize, the way that Star Wars that talks about the Force. Does that make sense? Or if I was talking about Star Wars, I wouldn't talk about quantum torpedoes because that's a Star Trek concept. Do you catch what I'm saying? Keep with where this thing has come from. Now, Christ means in the Greek, that is the Greek word for Messiah. So we have the Messiah, or anti-Messiah is the Hebrew word. Okay, so Jesus. Here's the point that happens. The Jews, when they were kind of considering. When the Jews had a whole bunch, they had a whole bunch of information about who the Messiah would be. Okay, and I'm going to stop using that pen. This is probably really hard to read. Okay, so they had how would they know who the Messiah would be? And they had over 650 prophecies related to how would they know who this guy was when he came. And the powerful thing that you see when you look at this is that you can take the Old Testament prophecies to know exactly who this Messiah was. And they missed the prophecies. Why did they miss those? Because, and this is important to understand Antichrist issues. When you miss the prophecies that they really struggled with is this suffering Messiah. They didn't catch it. They thought this guy would come in like a king. Now, here's the interesting part. They didn't catch the difference between the first coming and the second coming. Sorry, I'm turning off someone keeps texting me here. Now, so they didn't understand the difference between the first coming and the second coming here. But when you don't understand the difference between them, and you see them as one event, you're going to miss the information that Jesus fulfilled with the 650 prophecies in his first coming. Okay? And Jesus had to fulfill every single one of them to be considered that. Now, there was a statistic that was done a long time ago, and so I cannot remember how many numbers. But basically, you have a 1 in 1 with zeros that filled up an 8 by 13 or 8 by 11 page. You're going, what? It's an amazing amount. There's not been enough people in the whole planet, in the history of the world, that could actually fit that number. You're talking about like the number of the stars in the sky, which I think is even more than that. So that's how infinitesimal one person has to do to fit the prophecies of the first coming. And that's why when you understand that Jesus actually accomplished that, it is a big deal. Now, and we're not even into the Antichrist yet. When the Jews come to a full knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah in their statement, okay, in the Aramaic statement, when they do that, I'm going to share something with you fascinatingly, and you can watch this in other videos. Actually, I have this video series called Hope in the Last Days, okay, and it's a 12-part series that you can kind of check that out if you're interested in. But 2 Chronicles 7:14 talks about if my people will humble themselves, pray, and seek my face. I know a lot of people who will bring that verse up to me and say that's an American verse. And there's a whole long series why I talk about why it's not. But the reality is when the Jews come to Jesus at Rosh Hashanah, which is late in the tribulation, when he shows up in the clouds, Revelation 14:14, Revelation 14:16, when he shows up in the clouds, excuse me, and shows himself to be the second coming, because that's what he's about, the second coming, they realize that he is the king. Do you catch that? See, because in Revelation 14:14, Jesus has a crown on his head. Rosh Hashanah is the coronation of the king. So we have to first, again, we're looking at the prophecies, and there's a first and a second coming. Now, that's the background of this conversation. Okay. When we want to ask these questions, excuse me. Sorry, my cough is really bad today. Okay, so number one, the question is if how can we know that someone is the Antichrist? Okay, so the question is, who is this guy? And we get this all the time. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I hear this. And I have a friend of mine who's now saying, well, maybe Trump is the Antichrist. Can I just tell you how many times that actually has been questioned? World War I was called, excuse me, World War I was called the Great War, or the war to end all wars. They felt like the Kaiser was the Antichrist. No. Some people who believe falsely that Jesus fulfilled everything in Revelation in 70 AD, with Nero becoming the Antichrist and fulfilling all of the tribulational events, which is so ridiculous. There's a whole reason for why that doesn't even work. It's anti-biblical in a million ways. But people who do that, they think of Nero, and they think of Napoleon, and I mean, we can just keep going. Hitler, Stalin, all of these people are types. But guess what? Matthew 24 says you will see many antichrists. Okay. So we ask this question, who? So did you know that Ronald Reagan, his name actually matched up perfectly to the number of 666? And you go, how come? So he's got to be the Antichrist. And here's the part that you're missing. Revelation 6. In Revelation 6, verse 1, we have the first seal opened up. Now there's 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls. Now, without getting into the orders and all the other stuff with that too, the first seal, is the very first thing that happens. and the seals actually occur, fascinatingly, they occur all the way throughout. Because the 7th seal is such a perfect match to the last great major thing that happens. There's a silence in heaven. The 6th seal is actually perfect for the great earthquake, which is this earthquake that destroys everything. Now, if the first seal happens, here's what happens. They roll out the seals in heaven, and John is standing in heaven looking at all this stuff. And he rolls out the seals, and no one's able to open the puppy up. And John freaks out and doesn't know what to do. And he says, there's got to be someone who can do it. And the angel says, no, the lamb who was slain he says the lamb was slain, not before. The lamb was slain is worthy to open the seal. So the first thing that comes out in the first seal is the Antichrist. So guess what? Jesus introduces the Antichrist. That's number one. He's only revealed by the Antichrist. Many prophecy teachers want to say that, when the rapture of the bride goes, then there will be a cadre of people, a group, the cabal. They want to say that cabal will elevate this guy. No. Only Jesus will introduce this guy. Jesus has full and complete control because he's executing the will of God. Number two, we won't know the Antichrist beforehand because he comes out of obscurity. So here's one of the things that happens as well. We ask this question, is a guy an Antichrist? So we have a figure. Now, you might come up with this conversation of, is so-and-so the Antichrist? And the answer is, let me throw this one out here, because I have this all the time. Is Trump the Antichrist? Well, first off, apply the first point. So this is our number two. You have to apply the wisdom you just got from the first one. If Jesus is in control of introducing the Antichrist, when does Trump show up on the scene of the world? He shows up. Now, what's really interesting, he's been around. We're not talking about, that he was a developer in New York City in essence. But around 2015, he rides down an escalator with Melania, and he goes down the escalator, and we have this question, well, that's the introduction of Trump. Or you might say, no, that's not the introduction. It's when he wins the election. Now he's that person. Okay, great. You want to do that one? Fine. 2017, when he gets into office. Is that the introduction of the Antichrist? Well, those would have to be the case if you believe that Trump is the Antichrist. But that actually means today we are in 2022. We're in January of 2022. So that would mean here, the difference here is 7 years. Wait, the tribulation should be over by now. And that's what some people want to say. And the tribulation's over when Nasara actually brings in. No! You haven't fulfilled a ton of scriptures. You haven't done it. If you say, well, let's just do this one. What is that? That's 4 years. If you have 4 years before, from the time of his introduction to here, you're saying to me that it's 4 years. Well, guess what would have to happen in 4 years? You'd have to have the temple rebuilt. It's not been rebuilt. You'd have to have the mark of the beast. You go, oh, that's the vaccine. Everyone hasn't gotten that because they wouldn't be able to buy and sell. Come on. It doesn't work that way. You got to fulfill all the features. Remember we talked about with Jesus? Jesus fulfilled everything. The Antichrist actually has to fulfill everything too. The Bible talks a lot about this. And if he talks about the Antichrist, you have to take all of the word to define the character. I don't, like I just said, I don't take a little piece of Star Trek, the quantum torpedo, and then show it up in Star Wars series, and the people are like, oh, wait a second, that doesn't fit. A quantum torpedo is a Star Trekian idea, not a Star Wars idea. Do you catch my point? And yet, and I know we're talking about fictional things, but we're talking about what a writing says about itself. So it's talking about the Antichrist. So you have to apply the features. And if you cannot do that, he's not that. Because he has to come from obscurity. Now, Trump actually fits a couple of those things, but he doesn't fit them all. He doesn't come from obscurity, and there's a whole bunch of other things that we'll show you next. This is a big area here. Number 3 is we are not moving into the kingdom on earth until we have the tribulation. Okay, let me explain that 1 second. Lots of people want to say, there's a guy, and I won't bring up his name, but he talks about the basic idea is that Christians aren't thinking about they're not thinking about going to heaven. They're really thinking about bringing the kingdom to earth. What he's talking about is our final goal should be the millennial reign of Christ. And I go, I'm sorry, you don't get to do that. Matthew 22, 1 through 13 is all about the Father in heaven with the wedding feast. It's not the feast of the kingdom that would happen in the millennial reign. It's the feast in heaven. That's a different conversation. Jesus in Matthew 5 says, he talks about how shall I explain heaven? And he gives all these analogies. My goal is heaven. Okay? It is. It has to be gone that way. So when we say that we're going to bring the kingdom to earth, and then we're going to do that, but we're going to have that until we have the tribulation, you're flipping the order of it. You're flipping the order. You're messing it up. You don't know. You don't have information enough about it. And that's how they actually approve that the Antichrist can actually be here, and they flip the order of stuff. It doesn't work. I'm just telling you, it doesn't work. You've got to do it based upon the order that Christ does this. The tribulation is first, then we move into the kingdom time frame of the millennial reign, and then we move into the heaven. Just doesn't work any other way. Now, here's a really interesting one. Number 4. A big one that people come up with all the time on number 4 is this. They say, how come I say this, how come so many people feel like it's relatively peaceful in the tribulation? And so we ask this question about prophecy, okay? So we're asking a prophecy point, and we're relating this a little bit to the Antichrist, okay? But we're relating it also to the tribulation. Because, by the way, the Antichrist begins the tribulation. When he signs a peace treaty with Israel, he starts a peace treaty, and he signs it for 7 years. Now, some people would say, Trump just signed one. No, he signed one, but he didn't sign it with the whole world in the same way. Again, you can't just take one little thing and focus only on that one little event and ignore the other scriptures, because all scriptures God breathed. It has to be fulfilled. You cannot take one little thing. If you have one little spot off, it's in sin. If you have one sin in your life, are you going to be able to go to heaven? The answer is no. That's why we all need to have salvation even if we had one sin or millions of sins? The answer isn't. It says in Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So guess what? You can't fall short at all to come up with the Antichrist. You got to use all the scriptures out there. Now, some people will say that the first half of the tribulation is relatively peaceful. Let me show you how that's a real heavy misnomer. Most people, when they're trying to look at the tribulation, they don't understand it very clearly. So we have the tribulation that starts with the peace treaty by the Antichrist. So he is really important here. He sets a peace treaty with many nations, and that is in Daniel 9:27. Okay? He starts a peace treaty, but he says that 3.5 years into it, he breaks the peace treaty and he desecrates the temple. Okay? So he desecrates it, and he calls it abomination, a desolation, abomination that causes desolation. So you're talking about abominating the temple. Well, here's what you have to see in this first spot. We have the peace treaty that occurs here. If we do not have the temple today, so therefore we know we're not in the tribulation. Do you see how I'm putting these all together? So we must have the temple inside of the conversation of the tribulation. So in essence, what Daniel 9:27 is saying in a very left-handed way, it's hard to kind of put it all together, but you got to put it together. He's saying that if it's going to desecrate the temple, and you don't have a temple right yet, we're not in the tribulation. Simple. And if we don't have the temple, we don't have the Antichrist that's created a peace treaty, which has started the whole thing. And today, that's why Trump can't be the Antichrist, because we don't have a temple yet. And if he has to come out of obscurity, he doesn't get to come out of obscurity and stick around for a while until he starts all that stuff, okay? Again, you have to fulfill it all. Okay? So we're at a point where we don't have the temple. In the first half of the tribulation, there will be the temple. In the second half of the tribulation, we know that Satan actually comes into the Antichrist, and then it gets really bad. But what you're missing is this point. The third seal is actually World War III. Oops. World War III is the third seal. That means it's got to happen in that first half of the tribulation, somewhere in there. The second seal is what I would call hyperinflation. And we go, oh, but we're living in 2022, we're living with hyperinflation with all the things that they brought in from the Fed. No, that's being killed. The Fed's already dead. You're going to see it here soon if you haven't already seen it by the time you watch this video. So we're not in the second seal. We're not in the third seal because we haven't had World War III. You got to have World War III, and it is a big war. Then it leads into, disease and all of these, and it's really heavy disease. So there's a big, famine, there's famine and diseases and all this other stuff, because the second seal actually intimates an idea of hyperinflation with famines. And then we have the massive disease where it's the animals attacking the people. That's a type of disease point. And you go, we've had some of these as we go along, right, over the years. And people go, we've had this, so we got to be in the tribulation. Again, you got to do it all. You don't get to do a little part of it and jump away. Sorry. What I want you to know is the first half of the tribulation is as bad as any other time frame times 3. I'm just going to make up a number here, okay? It's as bad as any other time frame. Think about you living in the middle of World War II in France, or any other one of those countries that were taken over, oppressed, and they had disease and famine and hyperinflation. They had some of these kinds of things. They were living in that time frame. But we didn't have the Antichrist. We had almost every other kind of thing out there. It felt like it. But again, we didn't have the temple built, and I would say we also don't have the church gone away, and we'll explain that one here in just a minute. But those are part of those things. Now, what you have to also catch is that the second half of the tribulation, I would call it hell on earth. Why would you say that? Because the fourth trumpet has a big old nasty wormwood plume that opens up on the planet. Again, that hasn't happened, so we can't be deep in the tribulation. Again, another example of why it hasn't happened yet. The fifth trumpet is that all the people who are sealed of God, so the Christians in the second half of the tribulation, at that point, who are not dead yet, have a seal of God on the forehead so they cannot be harmed. So these really ugly hornets, I call them the murder hornets, okay, that's the Scott term. The murder hornets show up and they start stinging the people that are not sealed of God. And they want to die for 5 months, but they can't die. Now, if you want to die, you're going to find a way to kill yourself. What you're actually saying is suicide that doesn't happen. For 5 months, people are going to try to kill themselves, but they won't be able to do it. The sixth trumpet is about another world war, but it's actually where about 1.5 billion people die in about a 1 year period of time. Well, that's World War IV. I mean, do you see how many things are going bad here? Okay? Again, we're not in the tribulation. Again, then we get into the fifth one. Now, so we'll easily kind of move into this point. And I see people who believe in what's called a post-tribulation rapture. Now, we would actually term this pre-wrath position. Without getting into too much of the rapture thing, because you can watch my other videos and going through this, they believe the church has to wait throughout the tribulation and then will get taken out at the pre-wrath event. And I say to you this: if you think that the tribulation is survivable, there are a whole bunch of people that do this thing, okay? And I can give you names, but I'm not real relevant and interested in the names at this point. They think that you can live and make it through the end. Here's what you have to catch. Matthew 24, and I want to say it's verse 37, but I could be wrong on that one. So I'm just kind of catching off the top of my head. It says that if we don't limit the days, no flesh would survive. A friend of mine named Jeff Swanson actually says it a little bit differently. It's kind of cool, just an interpretation. If the days go 1 day longer, no one's alive. That's a really kind of cool way of thinking about it. The reality is that this is so almost unsurvivable. If you were to live at this point, there would only be maybe a couple million people. And I believe when you find out that the remnant, who are the Jews who make it in to the millennial reign of Christ, and it also talks about the separation of the sheep, which are the sheep nations, so this is not the Jews. These two groups of people come to Jesus, which I believe they come to Jesus at Rosh Hashanah, very late in the tribulation, when Jesus shows up in the clouds, we kind of mentioned that before, and they all come to, to a saving knowledge. Because you have to have these groups of people coming to a saving knowledge. And they live into the millennial reign, into the peaceful time frame. I would say that when I've done some of the numbers, it's maybe a couple million total of these people. Remember, the world has 8 billion people. So you're paring it down to just a tiny fraction of people. Maybe 1 or 2, 5%. I don't know the number. But that's how devastating the tribulation is. The reality is you can't make it until that last little time frame. And I want to share this last little piece with you. There's a bonus piece. I hear this quite a bit of the time. And we are going to, if you haven't watched my event, I talked a little bit about joy. And we talk about, what happens to this. So people who believe in essence, a post-tribulation rapture. Or it would be called, nowadays, they changed it to pre-wrath. By the way, when I first was studying this kind of position, they believed in a pure post-tribulation rapture, and that was back in the 90s. Around 2000, they stopped talking about it. They only called it a pre-wrath, which is somewhere before the end, okay? So when we talk about this, and I spend a lot of time on this thing, I'm reaching for a book here. It's called Rapture, Could There Be More Than One? And I explain that on my website, Dr. Scott Young, okay? But the post-tribulation rapture, here's what some people will say about this. They say that the church needs persecution. And they bring this up in this kind of context, that there are Chinese Christians who are going through massive persecution. And they're saying in their soul and their spirit, it actually is a good thing for them. What they say, what they're believing in this idea, is that Jesus will only come back for his pure bride. Well, so first off, these people are persecuted. So what they're basically saying is that persecution leads to purity. Okay? So here's our bonus round, a bonus point that you have to know about some surprising fact. If persecution leads to purity, then how about, let me just erase this bottom line here. If that's the truth, then how did the people in the Holocaust, if they're getting massive persecution, by the way, they did, massive persecution would lead to purity, then how about those people in the Holocaust? There were 5 million believers, political prisoners, all kinds of different people, POWs, that died in the Holocaust. You got 5 million here, others, and 6 million Jews who die in the Holocaust in the 40s, obviously World War II. And if the Holocaust would be a type of massive persecution up to including death, then why wouldn't that lead to a purity? By the way, if you actually go and do some of the research upon that issue, you will find something fascinating. That many of the Jewish, they were very heavily in their faith, in their Jewish situation. When they had the persecution, it doesn't lead to purity. It leads to unbelief many times. Because you go, how can God make me go through this? And so many of them actually pulled away from this. And I mean, listen, I've done the study on that thing. It doesn't lead to purity. It never has. So what in the world does persecution do to you? Let me show you what persecution scripturally does to you. And you actually know this, anyone who's lived through persecution. Persecution leads to character. It burns out. Now, see, that's not purity, okay? It leads to character or resolve. By the way, non-Christians and Christians can have the same thing. When you actually interact, and trust me, I've physically talked to plenty of Holocaust survivors. As an audiologist, I've done this for 32 years, and I've had plenty of these people that walk in my door. And what I find is a tremendous amount of character. And it doesn't mean that they're not Christians or Christians. Not even relevant to that. They're very strong in their character. They know what they feel about things. Okay? Character, again, is not purity. But it also leads to joy. That is nuts. In the world, and when we think about this, you go, persecution leads to character, which leads to joy. That's exactly what Paul's talking about. It doesn't lead persecution, because here's what it says in Hebrews 2:12, verse 2. For the joy set before Jesus, he endured the cross. Would you say that he was going through persecution? Uh-huh. So how come the joy set before him endures the cross? Because what happens, it creates joy in that person. Joy is a type of faith. Okay? So when we have this idea that persecution can lead to the idea of purity, which Jesus is only going to come back for his pure bride, and so we need to have that persecution to make us right, sharpening us up, well, it does lead to character, but I promise you, persecution is not a direct link to purity. I'm sorry. Now, you might disagree with me because you can come up with a guy who's done that. But most people, when they experience evil, and if you haven't experienced evil, you're missing the point. Because I've talked to these people who have had massive persecution. And it doesn't lead to that. It makes them resolved in what they believe. And many of them turn away from God because they see the evil and they can't resolve that. But they have a resolve in their character. No, they're strong characters, okay? But they actually have a part of hope, a part of faith that actually goes to joy. And even if they're not believers, or they're a big despair point, boy, that's really another part of this thing. But none of it leads directly to purity. That's why this is a big problem when we talk about the church with that. So I know I'm throwing you a whole bunch of different things out. If you want to know more about this, again, I have a book called Rapture, Could There Be More Than One? We have another DVD I'm looking over on the side over here. It's Hope in the Last Days. So there is a DVD series. It's coming out on my website here very, very soon. So you can kind of learn a lot more about this kind of stuff. So I hope that helped you to understand what's going on. Thanks so much.